So imagine you're buying a single family home on a street corner and you get it appraised, and the appraiser says, well, you could get quite a bit more density. You could do a 16 units on this. Wow, your land value just like went through the roof. And it's important for you to know that's how you create a lot of value.
Have you been thinking about buying your first rental property for some time, or do you already own a bunch of properties? Well, fellow investors, you found the right location to listen and learn from others' successes. Welcome to The Very Real Estate Effect with your host, Axel Mont-Saint-Jean.
Hello, and welcome back to the Very Real Estate Effect podcast, a show dedicated to real estate investing right here in Quebec. And today, as you can probably see if you're on video, I'm not in Quebec, but it leads to a good story. Now, it's been a while, as you know, that I've been working on several deals when it comes to development and redevelopment, both in Montreal and outside of urban areas. And I wanted to take the time today because I've had some questions. I was at an event and we started to talk with someone about a listing that she found. And I thought it'd be relevant to you, and I want to bring value, share this conversation so you can learn from it as well. Now, share this episode with a friend who's interested in land development because there's going to be plenty to learn from. This person was interested in a listing that was a street corner with an old house that wasn't renovated. But she said on the listing, they put a picture of a 3D of what could be done. So the current owner has already thought about redeveloping. And so it led me to the conversation of highest and best use, because then she's like, well, maybe I could just like keep the house and flip it, renovate it, and so on. I was like, no, if they already did a picture with a possible new building, that's what they're thinking of when they're selling the land, which means that that's how they've priced it. Now, into the details of it, I wanted to explain exactly what is highest and best use, because it's really important that you know and you understand what it is. So I'll go over that. I'll go over some of the factors that influence this very important real estate development law. And then basically after that, we'll take a couple minutes for some basic examples that you see almost on a daily basis when you walk around town, so you can really get a better idea of what is it that we're talking about in real life. So the highest and best use is super important when it comes to land. Now, as it sounds, the highest and best use. If you have a piece of land, what's the value of it? The value of it is what you can build on it. What use can you make? Okay, so think of this very example of the single family house on the street corner. It could be kept a single family house, or it could be redeveloped into a triplex, or it could be redeveloped into a 6 unit, or depending on how big the plot is, it could be a 12 unit with mixed use and commercial on the ground floor, and then some residential units up top. It really depends on what is allowed. So then, in understanding highest and best use, I want to go over some of the 4 key criterias that are needed to be able to qualify that. So again, this applies to land land, because any property is essentially a piece of land first. And then what is it that you do on it? So when it comes to highest and best use, the first of the 4 important criterias are: what is legally permissible to build? What does the current zoning or future zoning could allow legally? Now, let's take this example again of the single family house on the street corner. Is it possible to imagine that you could go to a triplex or a 6 unit or 4 unit or something? Yes. Do you think you're going to be able to do a 30-story high-rise tower? Highly unlikely. But 1 to 6 unit is entirely possible. So what is legally permissible? What is in the current zoning? What are you allowed for? You'd be so shocked by the number of properties where it's a single family home, but you're allowed to do up to a 4-plex. Right off the bat, you just need to know how to find the zoning and check it. Now, the second important criteria is: what is physically possible to build? So there's a number of factors when it comes to land geometry, so the shape of the land. It's not the same thing if it's a rectangle or a weird triangle, or like a super narrow rectangle along the street, or there's the geometry of the land is important. And when I say physically possible, we should also include the topography. So is it more or less flat? Is there a lot of slope? Are you between the road and the river, like my case? And then it comes with a bunch of physical constraints. Those are all the points that you need to take into account. Are you at the bottom of a cliff? Are you at top of a hill? Do you have a river running through it? What kind of access you have? All those things. Now, the third important criteria is the financial feasibility. Now, can you do a pro forma? Can you, on paper, do a project that financially makes sense? And when I say financially makes sense, is can you get the financing to build it? Can you build it? And then once you built it, does it pay for itself? And are you cash flow positive? I'm not going to go into the definition of what is a deal because everybody has a different definition. Some it's got to be like cash flowing from day one. Some it's okay to have a big equity upside, but basically, is it financially feasible? And now the fourth important factor when it comes to highest and best use is maximizing the productivity. What does that mean? That means that if you're allowed to do a 4 unit, then the highest and best use would be to do a 4 unit. Now, depending on the other factors, maybe the best deal is only to do a triplex because, for example, the land is narrow, so you need more height, so you need more cost, so you have more construction cost and structure and everything. It's just an example, okay? But what I'm trying to say, and I've discovered this kind of the hard way, is that it's not always about maximizing density. There's a fine balance to be found between the right density and the best financially feasible project. Again, the height is important. At some point, you can't go wood structure, you have to be concrete. Concrete is more expensive. If you start to do concrete for more than, let's say, 5 floors, then just doing concrete for 5 floors isn't really feasible all that much. So you need to try to go to 6 or 8 and all this. So those are just some of the cost factors that come into it. So for the land use, highest and best use, what is legally permissible, what is physically possible, what is financially feasible, and maximizing the productivity of the land. This is so important, obviously, to investors, to developers, to appraisers, because that's how you determine the land value. So imagine you're buying a single family home on a street corner and you get it appraised, and the appraiser says, well, you could get quite a bit more density. You could do a 16 units on this. Wow, your land value just like went through the roof. And it's important for you to know that's how you create a lot of value. Not a lot of people know how to find this. So if you can do it, you'll make money, hopefully. Now, some of the important factors influencing the highest and best use. So there is obviously 4 sets: legal, physical, market, and financial. So first, let's look at the legal. What does that mean? So legally, what you can do, what's the highest and best use? Because you have to go through zoning laws. Every city has per block, not necessarily a city block, but a zoning block, permissions on what is it that you can do and build. There's also sometimes restrictions from titles, from deed restrictions. And most importantly, there are environmental rules and regulation. I'll give you an example. On one of my projects, I'm between the road and the river. And on the river side, it means that we need to respect the riverbank, la bande riveraine, the river strip, and that's 45 feet. So we need to leave 45 feet between the building and the water. We can't build it. It's my land. I just can't do anything with it because I need to respect the river and the frogs who live there. Now, in the legal factors for highest and best use, it's really important to understand zoning and how zoning can be changed. You can submit a project that doesn't correspond to the current local zoning. There's still a possibility for it to be made, for your project to happen. There's a procedure in Quebec. It's called a PPC-moi, where it's I'm not going to go through what the acronym means in French and try to translate it in English because there's absolutely no point, but it's basically to submit a project that doesn't fit the current zoning, in which you do a modification to the current use of the property. It needs to get voted. It takes a little bit longer. You go through a comité consultatif d'urbanisme, urbanism consultative office. Anyways, you can create so much value by properly studying and understand zoning and also seeing trends. That's why I highly encourage you, if you're interested in a city and a neighborhood, to go attend city hall meetings, because that's where you learn what is it that they're talking about 3 to 6 months before it gets revealed, and you have a big opportunity to create. Now, that's for the legal, on the legal side. On the physical, as I said a bit earlier, the shape, the size, the topography, and the access. Okay. So the size, because the larger the better, the more chances of wider use. The shape, it's a huge difference if it's a rectangle, a weird strip, some weird triangle, or some odd shape that doesn't give you enough width for access, and so on and so forth. That mixed with topography, like is it flat? Is it super on a slope? Is there water in the middle? Is there wetlands? There's a lot of aspects that need to be taken into account, because it's not always the same thing. If it's flat or if it's a lot of slope, it's not the same build. And then obviously access. Imagine you have a large piece of land, but you only have like a narrow access in the corner. That's not optimal. You want to try to get 2 or 3 accesses in the middle, so on and so forth. Now, another aspect that needs to be taken into account, obviously, is to develop land, you need utilities, you need networks, you need water, sewer, power, and then, so with sewer, often you also can deal with your les pluviales, rainwater. It depends, but those 3 basic networks are the most important. Electricity, because we need electricity. You need fresh water supply, so you need to have enough pressure. You need to have the network to connect, so the size of the hose, the pressure, and then you need to have sewer. If you don't connect the city sewer, you may need to connect and have your own septic tank. Important to take into account. So that's the second set of factors. So we already talked about legal and we talked about physical. Now the third one is markets, market forces. Now there's supply and demand and there's market. Like, would you want to redevelop and bring more density to a city that's dying and there's a lot of vacant homes? Probably not. It needs to be in a place where there is demand, where there's increasing demand. I'm thinking of like Detroit, where they tore down entire neighborhoods just because they didn't want to leave empty houses. Like, why would you go try to bring more density to a place like that where they're tearing down? Maybe an extreme, but you're trying to get you get what I mean. So market forces, and if there's demand for what? And that's super important. Is it demand from families? Is it demand for office space, for warehousing? Like, there's so many different users, right? Residential, commercial, recreational, industrial. I mean, just there, I was going to say institutional. Um, and then market forces, is the city investing a lot on its local infrastructure? Are there new highways? Are there sports centers, hospitals, airports, industrial parks, you name it? And that's when it comes to the current demographics, the trends, and then the emerging economic drivers. As I said, is a university being built? Is a hospital coming in? Is the airport being increased, enlarged, made bigger? All those different things that drive economic activity, that show that there is demand, that justify bringing more density. Now, the last one, which is absolutely critical, is, having studied all this, can you take all those factors and turn it into something that is financially viable? Is the return on investment worth it? Are you going to make 2%? Are you going to make 8%? Are you going to make 15%? And that's just return on capital. But then what's also the impact for the local community? For example, let's say it's a business who wants to buy a piece of land to develop some housing for its staff. It's going to be renting to the staff, but it's going to be able to generate a lot more business because it's going to have more staff. So yes, the financial return is important, but there's also that multiplier effect that should always be taken into account, and that is sometimes a little harder to model. And that's when it connects to, the feasibility studies and the analysis, and obviously the cost benefits. Like, is it worth it For who? In my case, I'm developing land downtown in Saint Jerome. The city is pushing me a lot to go to do some affordable, to do some student housing, because there's a university and a CEGEP. I'd love to. Does it make sense? Is it feasible? Is the cost benefit worth it? And if yes, then what kind of product do we develop? Do we develop some some studios? Do we do some three bedrooms so students can shack up three of them and reduce their cost per room? Are we trying to attract young families, professionals, transit workers? All those different target markets come with a set of criterias that you need to tailor and to build to. So those are some of the important factors that come into highest and best use. So the legal factors, the physical ones, the market ones, and then the financial viability. Absolutely crucial. Now, for you to understand all this, sometimes it's best to just get a very simple example. Now, I'm sure it's happened to you. Think of when you drive out of a semi large city and you go through, okay, you're downtown, you exit, you kind of go through some commercial and industrial, then you kind of go through some low density residential, and then you kind of end up in the farmland in a nutshell. Now, the farmland has the tendency to get eaten and eaten over time. Now, there's forces to protect it because they just want to build more and more houses, but sometimes it goes just single family houses. So think of, let's say, the city is growing and it needs to also take into account its infrastructure and it needs to produce more electricity. And maybe they're not in Quebec where we have cheap water and hydroelectricity. And so all of a sudden they're like, next to this big city, there's this residential neighborhood and then there's some farmland. How about we were to take this farmland and convert it into a solar farm for and invest for the next 40 years? We install some panels and we produce electricity. What would that do, do you think, to the land value of that cornfield? It would rise big time. Or if we didn't do a solar farm, let's say we did a commercial park. So we do a shopping mall, or we develop and we do some industrial and some warehousing. It brings up that land value a lot from that cornfield once again. So, you know, I know you've been in this situation and you've thought about it before. Okay, another one, typical, because that's what we see a lot in Montreal. Think of that old warehouse in a neighborhood that's gentrifying and it's abandoned. It lacks any type of love, maintenance, care. It's really well located. And finally, after 10 years, someone's going to come by, demolish that old abandoned warehouse, and do a semi-commercial, a mixed-use property with nice commercial on the ground floor, maybe one or two stores, a cafe and a restaurant, and then some offices for a professional, and then upstairs to do some luxury condos. Now, we see this happen everywhere throughout the city. Now, think of what happened to that land value from that old warehouse where even the warehouse, you can do anything with it. You just needed to tear it down. So whoever bought it bought the value of the land, and that value of the land depended on what they could build on it. So at that point, they already went to the city and found out, oh, here I could do 6 floors. I could do mixed use. I could do commercial and residential. I could do that many units on a price per door. This is what I think it's worth. Boom, move forward. Land value greatly increased. And then, and then finally, as a third case, I'm going to go back to our original one. Think of the little house on the corner that has a huge garden yard, and the kids are happy to play there, but they have access to 2 streets, and it can be developed into a new multifamily building, 3, 4, 5, 6 units. Think of what you do to the land value after the approval from the zoning. It's amazing. There's so many opportunities like that. It's just that doing this takes a little bit of capital, it takes a lot of patience because you also have to work with the city, and that's tough. So some of the key determining factors is the timing, right? Obviously, this land value is going to increase. It's just at what speed. And when you're able to work with zoning, you basically force appreciation. If you can transform it from a single family to a 6 unit in a 6 months time, think of what you did to your land value. Yeah, exactly. And then The last thing is that in getting a project approved, when it comes to zoning, yes, it's legal, it's physical, it's financial, it's market forces, and so on. But there's a huge factor that doesn't need to be that can be omitted and that is often greatly underlooked is social acceptability. You are in a neighborhood with single family homes and you buy four pieces of land and say, I'm going to do a 32 unit, some of the neighbors don't want that. And they're going to fight it, even though it's a good thing because it would add a lot of housing. Um, having the community input and all the stakeholders involved and aligned has a huge effect in getting those projects approved. And sometimes the city says, if the neighbors are okay with it, we'll approve it. So then it's on the developer to go and seek these approvals, which I think is very unfair, but it is the way it is. So highest and best use. What can you do with a piece of land with all those factors? I'll let your creativity and imagination go wild. Thank you so much for sharing this episode with a friend who could benefit from this conversation. And I will talk to you next week. Thank you.